Hey everyone, and welcome to my channel. Merry Christmas, happy holidays, happy Hanukkah, happy December, happy end of 2020, all of the above. I am coming at you very festive today, probably the most festive you will ever see me, so congratulations. I wanted to talk about the shawl that I'm wearing today. This is a recent FO, and I thought it'd be kind of fun to just talk about the pattern, talk about my experience, the yarn, all of that with you, and just do a little separate video about it. Another thing that I was thinking about was that I don't knit very often in my videos, and that's what this whole channel is about. It's about knitting. So I've decided that I'm going to try to knit a little bit more while I talk to you about things. I'm currently working on a cardigan that just so happens to be green. I am very festive in this video, and part of it was intentional, and then the other part was just my life and the colors that I choose to work with, I guess. So this is the Raina shawl by Andrea Mowry. You may have recognized it because it is a very popular pattern by a very popular designer. It's one of those shawls that is just somewhat basic and simple. There's not like a ton going on. I mean, the most striking element I think is the border, but it's a classic combination of brioche and garter stitch, but I think it's still a beautiful shawl. It's not as eye-catching as like a lace shawl or something, but you know, really I think it does catch the eye, and I think it's kind of an understated beautiful accessory, and those are really the types of things that I like to knit. So I've had this shawl in my queue for, I don't know, like probably a year or longer, and I finally decided to buy some yarn for it and knit it up. It took me about a month, I believe, to knit it, and that's pretty quick for me. I was knitting a lot on it, and I was knitting like as fast as I could. I was seriously like flying through this shawl. And there were definitely parts about it that seemed to kind of drag on, especially the second brioche section. I'll talk about the construction in a minute, but there's multiple brioche sections, and that second brioche section it took so long, it took forever. So I finally made it through. Once I got past that section, it was so much quicker, or it felt quicker. So I will take it off and like show you the full thing. It's huge, it's enormous, but I want to talk about the yarn really quickly. So the yarn that I used is the Fibre Co, and I used Cumbria, which is a fingering weight yarn. I've never used the Fibre Co before, and I was really excited to try it, and it definitely lived up to whatever expectations I had. It's a beautiful yarn. I loved working with it. It says here that it is a lustrous blend of Masham wool, merino, and mohair, and I think it's right in that sweet spot of being a little bit rustic, and you know, it's got some structure to it. I really think it's going to hold up well, but it's also quite soft, so it's kind of right in between a more rustic wool and then like a soft merino, and I definitely see the mohair in it. So you can see the tiny bit of halo that it has. I'm backlit, and so that helps a little bit. You can also see the halo on my hair, but it has just the tiniest bit of halo that you would expect from a mohair blend. Okay, now I'm actually going to take the shawl off and show it to you. This is probably, by the way, how I would typically wear it under my coat. If I were to wear it on its own, I'd probably wrap it up all the way around me, but I like having some shawls that like hang down in the front to keep me really warm underneath my coat, so I had it on as if I would wear it under a coat. So this is a crescent-shaped shawl. It starts here in this solid garter stitch section, and it is an asymmetrical shawl. So here's one corner, and then I'm just going to go through the whole thing because this is such a huge shawl. It's quite wide as well, and it's very long, and it just keeps going. And then this is the other corner there. So if you noticed, there are alternating sections of garter stitch and brioche. So we have these two garter stitch sections here. We have the solid section, and then it is striped garter stitch. And then we have a big two-color brioche section. We have another garter stitch stripe section, another brioche section. Believe it or not, it's really hard to say. And then we have, lastly, the beautiful brioche border. I really like the lines of this shawl. I've always loved brioche and garter stitched together, and I think the border really complements the perpendicular lines really well. So I think it's beautiful. So talking about the really long rows, it actually wasn't that bad. I'm not much of a shawl knitter because I sometimes find it really boring. I really like knitting sweaters. But this one was pretty nice to knit because the whole thing is knit out of short rows. And I personally love short rows. I think they're very fun to knit, and I think they keep the knitting experience very interesting. Okay, so I got disrupted. It is hours later. It is now the end of the day. I'm sorry for the lighting change. I try to be so professional, but these things happen. So here we are, gonna finish this video. This also gives me the opportunity to correct myself because earlier when I was talking about this yarn, I pronounced it masham, and I believe it's pronounced massam. So it is spelled SH, but I think it's pronounced massam. So hopefully that's correct. The sheep that produce this wool are from Northern England. And I actually decided to look up some properties about this wool in comparison to merino. So it's kind of right in the middle, I think, in terms of softness and durability, and like what we consider like to be scratchiness in wool. So the micron count, I think, is between, let's see, I wrote this down. The micron count for massam is between 29 and 34, and for merino, microns are 24 or less. So it's like, it's soft, but it is definitely, it has more strength than merino. And then the staple length is also considerably long, I think between 6 and 10 inches. So I think that's pretty long for wool, but I don't pretend to know everything. So anyway, it is a lovely wool. While I was away, I decided to work on my cardigan, and I accidentally knit my row wrong. So I am currently tinking back about 300 stitches. So I believe I was talking about the short rows, and hopefully I'm picking up right where I left off, but I think that I was talking about the short row shaping. So I had never done brioche short rows before, and as I suspected, they were a lot of fun to do and pretty easy. It's pretty much what you would expect from a short row. There's nothing really like unique about brioche short rows in particular, except for one thing, and that is because for every one normal row, there are 2 brioche rows. So row 1 normal is actually row 1A and row 1B for brioche. So you can work row 1A across just fine, but when you're doing a short row, you can't just slide the stitches to the other side of the needle to work row 1B. So when you're doing a brioche short row, to work row 1B, you have to slip every single stitch back onto your right needle to then work the row again. And when you have few stitches, it's not that big of a deal, but as you can imagine, once you start getting 100, 200, 300 plus stitches, that's when that becomes a huge time suck. So the pattern does mention this, but I think it mentions it as like an optional thing. I would make it a required thing, and that is to purchase a second needle and use that. So when you're working your brioche rows, you can knit them, you can knit your stitches onto the second needle, and then you can slide your stitches to the other side of the needle to work row 1B or XB, whatever row you're on, to finish your short row. When I started this shawl, I didn't really think about the fact that I should have a second needle, and by the time I had done just a few rows of the brioche section, I realized I needed a second needle and I ordered one, but it did take until the next brioche section for me to actually get the needles that I ordered, and so I ended up knitting the whole brioche section by like slipping stitches one by one onto the other side of the needle. And by the time I was done with that section, I knew I could never do that again. It was just so painstaking. So I would definitely recommend purchasing that other needle. It is very worth it. And if you buy ChiaoGoo needles, for example, they're like $10, so it's worth the extra $10. Another modification that I made to this shawl is when I worked the brioche sections, I went down 1 needle size. So the shawl calls for a US needle 5, which is what I used to work the garter stitch sections. And then when I got to the brioche, I changed down to a 4. And I think that just makes a little bit neater of a brioche stitch. It sort of matches the gauge of the garter stitch a little bit better because brioche tends to be very loose and squishy, and it kind of stretches out a little bit. And so I just find that that looks really nice for me. So this border is an applied border, and what that means is that you actually knit it sideways. So you're working back and forth this way, whereas the rest of the shawl is knit back and forth this way, long ways. And the border, I think, is about 13 stitches that you're working on, and you knit, I think, 2 stitches off of the shawl for every, since it's brioche, it's every 2 rows you knit on the border. So you're slowly attaching the border to the rest of the shawl, and it creates this really pretty little section here. So the border takes a really long time to knit. It is probably the most time-consuming section because you are knitting brioche lace, and for, I would say, the first like few inches that you're knitting, you do have to reference the pattern and kind of think about what you're doing. After that, it does become memorizable. You still have to think about it and pay attention to what you're doing, but I think it's a 4-row repeat. So in brioche that would be 8 rows, but it's pretty much just a 4-row repeat in terms of what you actually have to think about. And so I found it to be pretty smooth sailing once I got the hang of it. But again, do you see the length of this shawl? It's huge, and I will show a photo of it when I was blocking it because I had to use my couch to block it. It was so long. I also saw a tip on Ravelry for the border that I wish I would have seen when I was knitting it, which is to use DPNs when you're knitting the border. I just used the circular needles I was using to knit the shawl, so they were really long, and with DPNs you can just quickly flip your work a lot easier, and so I would totally use DPNs if I were to knit this again. The last thing that I wanted to mention was the yardage requirement. So as you can see, I ended up with 2 full skeins left over, and I also ended up with these partial skeins. So I ended up with quite a lot of yarn. I haven't weighed this, but it's a relatively significant amount of yarn left over, and I noticed that other Ravelry users had the same issue. The pattern calls for, I think, over 800 yards of each color, and I used less than 700 yards of each color. I think I used about 650-ish, actually less than that because I had these partial skeins. So I probably used about 600-ish yards of each color. So that's between 400 and 500 total yards that I did not use. So I'm not sure why the yardage was so off, but I did not do a gauge swatch, in part because I was a little bit lazy. Also, I don't typically knit gauge swatches for shawls unless I'm concerned about the yardage. In this case, I was totally fine. I did measure my garter stitch once I got a little ways into the pattern, and I was pretty close to gauge, so I'm not sure why I had so much yarn left over, but like I said, I did read that some other knitters had the same problem. Yardage requirements can be very challenging to figure out, even for dedicated pattern designers, and the reason is that it's not 100% exact, as with most things in life really, but the way that you figure out yardage requirements across multiple sizes, which for this shawl shouldn't be an issue because this is not graded, there's just one size, but in general, if you're grading a pattern, you figure out how many yards you knit for your sample, and then you measure the surface area of your sample, and then you use ratios for each size that you're grading to, and you use your original yardage requirement to calculate the yardage requirements for the rest of your samples. But the problem is that if there's a small error, there's a small margin of error, which there always is when you're measuring something, that error gets multiplied across the rest of the sizes. So what can be a pretty small difference in yardage for like the first few sizes, it can end up being a really big difference when you get up to the bigger sizes or the smaller sizes, depending on whatever your sample was. So it can be really challenging, and I always try to be forgiving of pattern designers if there is an issue with yardage, because it's just such a tricky thing to figure out. And if there's even a small difference in gauge, it really can be a big difference in yardage requirements. So again, I'm not very upset about it, but I just think it's something to note in case you were to knit this shawl. Maybe err on the side of less yardage and try to pick a yarn that you can readily order more yarn of if you really need to. And that way you don't have to end up with a lot of extra yarn, but just in case, you can still finish your project, because that really is the worst if you can't finish your project. So that's it for me. I hope you enjoyed this rather chaotic video. That's 2020 for you, and honestly, life. So I hope it was helpful. Nonetheless, please let me know if you decide to knit this shawl. It's a lovely shawl. I loved working on it. I'm gonna fix my mistake now, and I will see you in the next one.